Today in the Smart Wood Shop, I'm going to take you through step by step building this box joint jig, specifically for the Paulk Smart router table. A box joint, also called a finger joint, is a very strong, attractive joint, and it's a nice skill to have in your hip pocket. You might not use it all the time, but sometimes you'll come up with something that you want to just add that little bit of craftsmanship to, that touch. When people see it, they know that there was a little skill involved in putting it together. But the truth is, it's not very difficult to do if you have a fixture like this to pull off those perfectly fit joints. This box joint jig design isn't anything that I came up with. It's been floating around in the woodworking world for as long as I've been a carpenter. In fact, I built something very similar to this about 30 years ago. The difference in this one and the others is it's some modifications to make it work with the Paulk Smart router table. This router table is designed with the 32 millimeter system, the bench dog holes. So I get this perfect layout. There's a lot of reasons that this is my very favorite router table. There's videos on this and on this particular design, but I do a lot with my router tables. In fact, I use two of them together to extend my bench real estate, and also so that I can run two routers when I'm in the production mode. So with the router table that I have and these bench dog holes, in a 32 millimeter spacing, meaning that in this case they're 96 millimeters or 3 times 32. What I bring to this age-old design is just a little simplicity. The heart of the system here is this base plate. The base plate is really what gives you your precision. It needs to be placed on your router table two-dimensionally, very precise. In the typical design, the base plate is a little bit deeper this way, and then there is a ledger put on the bottom of that square, and then you're able to bump the plate right up where it needs to go in this direction or this orientation. The other dimension is from the end of your router table to the very center of your router. That's a critical point, because once you build it all, you need to know when you put it on your router table, it's in that exact location every single time. With the bench dog holes precisely located on the Paulk Smart router table, what I've done is eliminate that lip that needs to be out here, and also the spacing from the edge. Typically, what you do with the traditional design is you build a wood T-square, basically, that you put on this edge and bump this plate to, and then you take a couple of clamps and you clamp it down. With this design, I'm using the bench dog holes to give me my positioning from the edge of the router table and also from the end. So with these holes drilled in the right location, then every single time when I take the bench dogs and drop them in, I know that this base is exactly in the same location time and time again. Not only is it located, but it's going to stay where it's located. This frees me up from having to use a couple of clamps to hold it in place, which frees up a little space when I'm working as well. This design also provides some flexibility. You have the base unit, and all of this is the same no matter what size of box joint you're going to cut. But this piece here, you can make multiples of these. This is specific to the size of the box joint. This one is set up for 1/2 inch. So with a 1/2 inch bit and also the 1/2 inch spacer, then I know that each and every time I will get my 1/2 inch box joint. Also, I've added this dado along the top, and I don't know if I'm going to continue this, but it's just a storage area for the spacers. These spacers are built specifically, again, for the size of that box joint. So I can make multiples of these a 1/2 inch in this case. I can make a 1/4 inch. I can make a 3/4 inch, whatever size I want, and have all of that contained in this one piece. And then by putting it on the base unit, then I can set it up with the appropriate bit and get whatever size I want. I'm going to start by first building this base plate because everything else is built around it on top of it. I am going to build mine using metric or millimeters, mainly because the math for me is a lot easier using whole numbers, and the fact that the router bench is also built using the metric system. So finding center and laying out will just be a lot easier. Obviously, you can build this using in the imperial system as well. The base is a perfect square at 300 millimeters by 300 millimeters. Start by taking some 18 mil plywood and cutting a perfect square on the table saw. And now I'm going to make the subfence, again out of 18 millimeter ply. And then I'm going to make the rails, making them exactly the width as the thickness of the plywood. So it's a perfect little 18 millimeter by 18 millimeter cube. And then I'm going to rip the finished fence. I'm ripping the extra long piece because I'm going to make 3 of those so I can have 3 different sizes of box joint. Now at this point, I am setting up the base. This is critical to get it lined up absolutely perfectly. So I've checked it all different ways. And now I'm just tapping in from underneath with a 20 millimeter bit, just basically an onion skin cut there, just enough so that I can flip it over and see the holes. And then I can use my Parf Guide Mark II to get a perfect hole drilled straight up and down, and then use the Parf Guide for alignment of the second hole. So I know this will fit perfectly on the bench and line up perfectly. And also I set them in 32 millimeters to center. That was from the edge, which is how the router table is set up. I could also put in some holes further up in a different set of holes, and I may play with that in the future, but it seems to be working good on the 2 outside holes. And now I just took a bit, a standard Forstner bit, and drilled a hole. This is for that middle slot. It's not as critical. I didn't want to make it too wide, but it's wide enough for any size bit that I'm going to use for box joint. And then I finished the cutout on the table saw, so I didn't need a jigsaw, and I got a nice little cut. And then took a router and just took and put a chamfer on the edges. And now I'm cutting the rails to length. And then I'm using a card on each end here to give me just enough space so that it's good and tight and doesn't wobble, but will slide back and forth nicely. Then I measured the distance at that point. If you like hanging out in the Smart Woodshop, if you're enjoying these videos, if you've learned anything, make sure you give me a thumbs up and subscribe. And remember, when you subscribe, to ring that bell so you'll know when I put up a new video. Also, if you get a chance, if you could share this channel with somebody you know, it'd really help to grow the Smart Woodshop family. If you'd like to get a set of plans to build a Smart Woodshop or one of my workbenches, you can click on the link in the description of this video down below. Now here I'm gluing up the subfence. It's basically an L bracket. So I got it glued up and put some clamps on it, and then I put 4 screws in through the bottom there, and the 2 kind of in the middle are on either side of where the router bit is going to go through. Now I'm attaching the subfence to the 2 rails. I'll be gluing and screwing them on. The long part of the rails out in front to keep it from tipping when I push it forward. And I'm using a clamp, but the clamp is just barely there. I didn't tighten it too much because I didn't want to snug it up too much. If I wanted to really tighten it, I might have put like 3 cards in instead of 1. And now just checking it out, I'm going to wax it up, but for now I just want to make sure it slides back and forth and doesn't bind. If it's too wide, then when you push on it, it might twist one way or the other and kind of bind up. Now this is the 2 holes for the flange bolts. These are in the subfence, and they are to attach the finished fence to the subfence. Now I'm running the extra long board for the T-track, 1 pass with for the slot, and then 2nd pass with the T-cutter, and then I'll cut these down to length, so I'll have 3 blanks to make different size box joints. This is the final step in setting up the box joint jig. Everything we've done, the base, the subfence, the rails, they all remain the same no matter what the cutter is. But what I did was, for the final face, I made a longer piece, a piece that was 3 times longer than what I needed. I cut the T-track in it, and then I cut it down to size. So now I have 3 of these blanks, and I can set up each one for a different size router bit. So what you see me do here with this 5/16 inch bit will be the same process no matter what size bit you use. So this is 5/16. I'm going to set up this one. I'm going to go ahead and set up a 1/2 inch, and then I'll probably keep another blank and decide later if I want to set up a 3/4 or go down to something very narrow. To make the face, I have to do 2 slots. The first one will be with this setup completely centered. This first slot is set up. This is not the one the spline will go in. This is the one the cutter will go through. But I'm using it to make the spline or the spacers. I'm using my push block so that I can just sneak up on the cut until they fit in snug, but I don't push them too hard. You don't want them too big because they'll be difficult to use when you're actually making the cut. This spline here that I'm cutting is specific to the 5/16 cutter that I'm using. So I would repeat this process here for each size cutter. With the spline cut, I'm cutting a 50mm piece. That's the one that will actually be mounted and glued in place. And then 2 about 125mm pieces, and those are just spacers. They're used for setup only. And I'll be doing a dado in the top of the finished fence to store those so I can keep all the pertinent pieces to each cut stored on board. So here I've used the 2 spacers to get double the spacing of the width of the cutter, and that set the fence off to one side, and I made the second slot, and this is the slot that I will put the 50mm spline into with some glue and screw it into place. And again, this will be specific for each cutter. Now the moment of truth. I'm going to try to make my first box joint, 5/16 inch box joint. So I took a piece of scrap, cut it in half, and started by just butting it up to the spline piece there and making the first cut and then stepping it across. You can see how easy each of those box joints slips over the spline. If I made it too big, I'd be struggling every time I wanted to move it. So that's critical to get that just right. And then instead of using a spacer, I just used the material for the first cut, and then I was able to jump back to the spline and make the cuts. And I didn't do the back cutting like I normally do on this plywood. This cutter must have been fresh and new. It did a beautiful job. That's just how easy it is to make a perfect box joint without any test cutting or sneaking up on it. It fits perfect every time. That is, if you've got a jig like this to help you. If you'd like to build a box joint jig like this for yourself to work with your Paulk Smart router table, I've put up a set of plans in the store that you can go and purchase and download anytime. I do want to emphasize that I didn't create this design. I took an existing design that's been floating around out there for decades, and I have just made some modifications to it to make it a little simpler and to make it work specifically with the Paulk Smart router table. Thanks for dropping into the Smart Woodshop. You stay safe and have a great day.